Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the law school for this incredibly important conference. Now, long before Ferguson, long before Eric Gardner, long before the recent police shootings in South Carolina, our law students here at the law school, under the extraordinary leadership of Professor Craig Futterman, have worked to further the objectives of police accountability. The Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project of the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic was created in 2000, created by Professor Futterman under the direction of Professor Randolph Stone, and is noted as the first of its kind in the nation, as well as for achieving a broad variety of wonderful results in cases in Chicago and elsewhere. Now, students in the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Clinic, along with their partners in the Invisible Institute, have long recognized the importance of studying and working to improve the interactions and relationships between Black youth and the police. Over the last 4 years, University of Chicago law students have intensely studied how teenagers experience encounters with the police. Their work is a wonderful example of the value of interdisciplinary work, which is part of our DNA as a law school. Law students have worked with teams of journalists, documentary filmmakers, sociologists, anthropologists, and public policy students at the university, and also with lawyers, policymakers, and teachers. Most of all, our students have come to appreciate all that they could learn from listening to young people, that young men and women possess relevant knowledge and also experience that is missing from the current discourse over the relationship between the police and our inner city communities. This conference builds upon all that we have learned from this terrific work. It seeks to bring together you, a larger and more diverse audience than is usual at academic conferences, people from all spheres, not typically in the same conversation. We have here researchers, policymakers, judges, law enforcement, youth, lawyers, teachers, students, organizers, service providers, and our neighbors. And we bring all of you together today to engage in these difficult questions and to guide our policy, our research, and our advocacy. Now, I couldn't imagine, it almost seems obvious to say this, but I can't imagine a more timely event or a more important topic. I'm excited that all of you are here with us today. Now, before we kick off the conference, I would like to thank some of the folks who have provided us with generous support. Thank you to the Cantor family, who supports so much policy-relevant work here at the law school. Thank you to the university's Office of Civic Engagement, as well as the Urban Network. And of course, thank you to all of the presenters today and the participants in our discussion today and tomorrow, and the variety of organizations that are set forth in the program who have also contributed time, energy, and resources to making this conference so important. And now what I'd like to do is turn the podium over to Craig Futterman, our indomitable, terrific, energetic, brilliant Craig Futterman, and wish him and you 2 days of productive discussion. I look forward to hearing some of it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, right, and welcome. As Dean Schill shared, and can y'all hear me back there? Okay, cool. As Dean Schill shared, this conference promises to be something special. This is a little bit different than, it's different in a lot of ways than some of our typical academic conferences. I look around the room and first I do see, as typical from a lot of academic conferences, some of the world's greatest minds and world's greatest researchers and academics here present in this room and will be with us over the next couple of days. But I'm also just looking in front of me, I'm seeing young people who we work with, teachers, as Dean Schill said, that I see police officers who are present, policymakers, even judges, and our neighbors from the surrounding community. In the same room, at the same time, in the same conversation. We hope our goal is to try to deepen the national conversation about race and police, a conversation that raises some of our country's most fundamental issues. And we want to do that from a view from the ground, a view from some of the young folk who are here, who are most affected by police practices. As Dean Schill said, over the last 4 years, we've studied how teenagers experience police, something that we affectionately call the Youth Police Project. And it's the youth/police, and there was a lot of arguments over the slash and what to do, youth and police, most importantly, not youth versus police. And this was purposefully not an adversarial project with black kids on one side and police on the other. In the last 3 years, or in the last, in the first year of the project, we were working and talking with kids around the South and West Sides and Chicago public high schools about their experiences. And the last 3 years, we've been working closely and intensively with high school students here at Hyde Park Academy through a media program run by Ms. Kiva McGee. Chicago Public High School, for those of you who don't know Hyde Park, just about 3 blocks from the law school, 3 blocks from here. And our conversations with the kids focused on their everyday encounters with police, the everyday, the normal, the routine, not the high-profile incidents of police abuse. And while just a couple blocks away, high school students from Hyde Park shared with us experiences that felt to my students and felt even to me sometimes like they were experiences that were from a completely different world from our world here on campus. A world where there were some different rules, different practices, and sometimes even a different constitution. This conference, as Dean Schill says, builds first and foremost from all that we learned from the kids on the ground, our conversation, and then also, I should say, from conversations that we've had with police officers about how they experience this very same encounters. So I feel blessed today, truly blessed to be among all of you again, people who are not always typically a part of the same conversation, but who really need to be so that we can have a discussion, and a real discussion, about what needs to be done to improve policy, to improve our research, and to improve our advocacy, to improve both the lives of young people, not just young people here, but young people around the country, and also to improve the effectiveness of police in addressing real issues of violence, to offer real practical solutions to some of our country's most vexing problems. Again, not youth versus police, youth and police. Okay, as Dean Schill noted, full disclosure, he said that I direct a civil rights clinic here at the law school. And one of the things that my students have done, Dean Schill referred to, we brought cases. And my clinic students have sued police officers. We've even sued entire police departments for patterns of civil rights violations. We know what can get you in trouble. But I want to say that I'm far from a hater, and that's what I tried to also model with our students too. I have deep respect and admiration for the job, for the profession, for men and women who do policing right. But I also hate police abuse. And I don't hate it only because it inflicts serious harm and has inflicted serious harm on ordinary people and their families and entire communities, I know that's reason enough to hate it. I also hate it because I know the damage that it does to good police, the dishonor it brings to a profession and people who I deeply respect. And this conference is designed with those sentiments in mind. Before I turn things over to Jamie to really kick us off and to start our first panel, Jamie Calvin, close friend, conspirator. I could first need to express my heartfelt thanks first to Dean Schill and the law school, my colleagues at the Mandalay Legal Aid Clinic, because without the support of the law school, of the dean, my colleagues, this conference just wouldn't happen. We wouldn't be here today. I'm also grateful for, as the dean mentioned, for the generous support of the Cantor family, the Office of Civic Engagement of the university, and the Urban Network for their generous support. And I'm also deeply grateful for, and I'm sorry, I know the thanks are boring, but this is important, and really we should acknowledge the folks who brought us together and have done the real work behind the scenes. So many of our sponsors, organizations that represent kids, law enforcement, and other of our campus partners who you'll see in the program itself, who have contributed in ways more than just money, but in their time, effort, supporting us, everything that we've asked for, folks have stepped up and done. And we'll appropriately also recognize the Youth Police team later in this conference. Most importantly, of course, we couldn't have done any of this without the partnership of Ms. McGee, a special public school teacher who directs the media program at Hyde Park Academy, and all of her students. This is ultimately for y'all. Before I close, distrust between Black kids and police, that didn't just start in Ferguson. It's been here for years. And it's done way too much damage, way too much damage, both to Black communities and police. Our goal when you come out of this conference, we hope that you walk out with something more than a memory of, man, this was a great conversation. We really learned things from one another. That was cool. But that I hope that everyone walks out of here with something that we could take back with us, something we could take back to our colleagues, to our departments, to our schools, to our policymakers, to our community, something real, something concrete. This conference, to me, represents an opportunity for more than great conversation and great talk, which I know we'll have, but it presents an opportunity for real change. And with that, I just want to welcome you to the Youth Police Conference.
Thanks, Craig. We call this the Youth Police Conference, but I think what we intend is the Youth Police Conversation. This will not be a conventional academic conference with presentations and a sequence of speakers speaking at the audience, but not with one another. The essence of the conference is the conversation we'll have together. And the design of the conference is meant to facilitate that. So there will be a series of moderated panel conversations that will then open up into conversations with all of you, anyone who wants to engage. Those conversations will be preceded and kind of grounded by short videos that we produced with our young colleagues and collaborators at Hyde Park Academy in Ms. McGee's class. We really want to make sure that the conversation as it unfolds remains grounded in their reality and the things we've learned from them over these last several years. Also, each of you should have a short paper Craig and I wrote called Notes on the Youth Police Project to provide some background on the project and a kind of point of departure for the conversations that will unfold shortly. I have a few other just purely housekeeping details. Remember to keep your cell phones on silent. Also, there's no food or beverages in the auditorium. If you want to follow and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag at YouthPolice, at YouShy engagement. YouShy engagement will be live tweeting, and you can follow at Jamie Calvin for the Invisible Institute's perspective as well. I should confess to you, I don't know how to tweet, as I've probably illustrated in reading these directions. So there are little munchkins up in the control room who do the tweeting for the Invisible Institute. Also, if you want to be on the Invisible Institute's email list, you can sign up at invisibleinstitute.com or at the reception desk, the registration desk. Finally, there is a reception in the classroom hallway outside the auditorium immediately following the last session today. An extraordinary series of events across the nation have brought us to something akin to a truth and reconciliation moment with respect to patterns of police abuse and impunity in minority communities. Largely ceremonial at the national level, this dynamic is, as we've seen in a number of jurisdictions across the country, complex and volatile at the local level. I think there are lessons that we can learn from other nations around the world and other polities that have been confronted with the challenge of reckoning with the nature of their own societies, with things that are fundamental to the way life is organized in their societies. I'm thinking particularly of settings where there have been what are generally referred to as truth and reconciliation processes, when nations try to fashion and articulate a transition from eras of repression to a more humane and democratic society. There are several particular lessons, I think, that can be extracted for our purposes. Two central themes that such efforts almost always share are public acknowledgement and accountability. By public acknowledgement, I mean a kind of reckoning within the society with a set of harms that have been inflicted on some members of the society, some populations within the society. Telling the stories, documenting, fully documenting what happened historically and over time, and doing it in a way that translates the private knowledge that people carry, often, with respect to repressive and violent regimes, harrowing, isolating knowledge, that translates that private knowledge into a public acknowledgement. And when that happens and is fully realized, it's transformative. It enables the life of the society to go forward. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the challenge of addressing the kind of harms that have become so massively visible in the last year in our society are similar to that. The press often likes to put the frame of crisis around sort of major ongoing stories, but it doesn't really fit to describe this amazing kind of phenomena across the country right now as a crisis. It's not a radical departure from the norm. What we're seeing is the norm. What we're seeing are things about fundamental features of our society that we've managed to live with but not see. What we're seeing are harms that fall on some of our fellow citizens and not others. What we're seeing, as Craig alluded to, is the sense in which we have really two constitutions, that the Constitution means one thing where we're standing right now, and something quite different a few blocks from where we are right now, and where some of our friends and colleagues from Hyde Park Academy live. The second sort of core principle, along with public acknowledgement and trying to figure out what that means, is the priority of accountability. There have been lots of ideas and different strategies and policy interventions that have been talked about in the context of the current debate about police abuse. What we will be arguing and engaging with you about in the course of this conference is the notion that accountability has priority. If we don't create meaningful mechanisms of accountability so that when police officers exceed their powers and abuse citizens, then all sorts of other good ideas, sensible ideas, reasonable policy suggestions will be undermined, if not altogether impeached. So public accountability and public acknowledgement and accountability. Finally, I think it's also important, and there are splendid examples of this around the world, that statesmanship will be required on all sides if we're to articulate a path forward that shines a light on longstanding patterns of human rights violations, while building and maintaining the relationships that will be required incrementally and over time to effectively address those harms. The hope with which we open this conference is that we will together advance the work of publicly acknowledging the harms while building the relationships to address them. And now we'll begin with the first panel, and we'll start with the first video.
Jamari Triggs. Malik Gardner.
Deanna Rice.
Richard Porter.
I'm Christopher Moore. Yeah, that's an everyday thing.
I mean, I just be walking, my friends or something. Or, I could be walking by myself and then, they'll pull up, get on the car, or get on the wall, spread your legs, put your hands up, put your hands on the gate, don't move, searching my pockets,
How often does that happen?
Pretty much every time I go outside.
I was with my father. I was walking down the street from my block. I was with my father. The police pulled up on the side of me and my dad and got out the car and put me and my father on the gate. Started searching us and everything. And then my dad said, "Why'd you pulling me and my son over? I'm just walking with my son to the store." And they said, "Y'all fit a description. Y'all look like y'all was on something or something. Like y'all had something in y'all pocket or something." So they searched us and whatever.
They just look at you funny, like, we know you doing something, but we gonna wait till you do it.
They stopped us and they asked me, where the fuck I'm going. Then that's when they went in my pockets, threw my keys, and took my money. And I had to go up to the 71st Street police station to get it back. And they said, I asked for the officer, that harassed me. They said they couldn't find him.
And sometimes I see this all the time, they ride up slow, they get out patiently and just get on the car. Like this, they used to doing it. Get on the car for what?
Like the way they come up on you, it's in the safari or something. When they see prey, they attack,
Hey, they pulled up, it was like 6 cars that pulled up. They hopped out fast and, get on the wall, hand information down, and then they was like, you all now being dispersed, y'all. We better not see y'all over here for the rest of the night. Catch y'all going to jail, no questions asked.
I've been in a couple situations when the police come around and the boy put his hand over my shoulder. I'm like, come on, let's walk. And then I'll walk with him. And then as soon as the police leave, they'll come on, we gotta go, But they use me, they use females, period, for a reason for them not to get messed with. And he didn't have to even have nothing on him. He just ain't want to feel like getting stopped going through that.
We just walking throwing snowballs, and they stopped us like, "Hey, what you doing?" And I was like, "We're throwing snowballs." And then they got, "Are you trying to get smart?" And they started to yell this, and that. And I hit the first thought in my mind was just run. But I was like, "Nah, I'm gonna stay here." And they got out the car, they patted us down. They put one of the dudes in handcuffs for no reason, put him in the back seat. I guess that was just, he was talking smart and all that other being disrespectful. But then, like, they let us all go.
You can't even hang out no more. That's how, like, if they see you as a group, they stop you.
Every time I get off the bus, I have to walk down 74th, and it's some, like, depending on what time I make it, it'll be a police car or two passing. And, like, as soon as I hit the alley, they'll slowly go. So I try to put my head down and play with my phone, so they can keep going.
It's like restricting. You can't do stuff that regular people would because it's like you being harassed.
Like, if I'm in a car, we just try to just go on about our way, just drive past and just hope they don't mess with us that day.
Yeah, like, if I'm outside with my friends, like, if I see the police, like, sometimes I, go up the street, walk by myself, just so, they don't bother me. They could target the crowd, but not me, though.
If you got dreads, that you're an easy target, because there's a lot of kids with dreads in my neighborhood.
I try not to have any run-ins with the police because I don't know how they're gonna hop out the car or how many people are actually in the car or how their day has been going. Because, like, if they're having a bad day, they can easily just take it out on you just because they're the police.
I mean, we just gotta pick our places where we gotta go. Like, we know where the police at. We know how the police is in certain neighborhoods, so why would we go somewhere where the police is more strict than to get in trouble over there? Because somebody might talk back or, get into an argument with them and we all just, where we gonna hang out at?
It make you want to change your routes. Police, because you don't know what they got.
It made me feel small because, like, I was stopped for no reason. I was just minding my business.
I mean, every situation is upsetting.
They make you feel less of a person.
I feel like we're enemies because we have no relationship and you're just harassing me now.
The police nowadays, they making it harder to serve and protect because now all the kids are thinking that the police are bad. Like, if you see a police officer, they shouldn't go to a police officer. It shouldn't be like that.
It makes me feel angry, like, why'd you stopping us? All this killing that's going on, why'd you stopping us? We innocent, we going to a destination.
Steady harassing people, like, that's not gonna make them wanna work with you.
They're over you and you're under them. Therefore, you don't matter. Their word will prevail over yours.
I'm almost a man, but it made me feel less than a man, Them stopping me and, somebody going into my pockets, It just make you feel down, like you ain't nobody. And they make you feel like that because they think they the police and they got all the power.
We have focused our attention not on the egregious instance of police abuse that everybody knows is horrific, but really on the everyday encounters, everyday interactions, most of which would not rise to the level of the law in any circumstance. We've tried to see what we could learn from that. So many of our conversations have been focused on trying to hear deeply the accounts of young people about their everyday encounters with the police. I wanted to start by asking Chaselyn, who's been central to this work over the last 3 years, what it was like when she first went into classrooms to try to start those conversations.
Enjoyable, mostly. The kids have tons to say about the police. We usually start the early workshops just by asking, what do you think about the police? And tons of hands shoot up if they raise their hands at all. They have a lot to say about what the police are in their neighborhoods, what they look like, what they feel like. We did run into some early problems because they thought we only wanted to hear the big stories, the stories of someone getting beat down or someone being shot and killed, those sorts of stories. The more we asked them, but tell us about the little encounters, tell us about the everyday. they thought, why? It's boring. Why are you asking us about this? Why do we talk about this every single week? And for us, really the basis of the research and what we've learned from them is that the atmosphere of policing is different. It's different here than it is there. They have experiences with police that we can't imagine. It's important not to pretend like we can understand the way that the kids feel or the way that they have to encounter the police in their everyday experiences. The idea being that they know things we don't know. They know a lot about the police. They know when police change their habits. They know when policies change. They know quicker than anybody what the police are doing on the street, and that knowledge is incredibly valuable.
So Tatiana, what was it like when Chaselyn first walked into your class?
First, it was kind of annoying because they kept showing up every single day on time, asking the same questions until they took it a step further and started asking like how we felt. Like it just like they wanted to interview us, and I'm like, why? Like this is kind of wild. Like, why do you want to interview me? And it was just like a stepping stone at first, because usually people don't really care about if we get stopped by the police, but you know, it was just them steady showing up. It was like I kind of got used to it after a while.
I mean, is there a sense in which it became more interesting to you as the conversation unfolded?
We started role playing, and then we even seen videos from places like Detroit, different like just listening to different stories. It was kind of, you know, like this is a real life issue, and this is not only happening with us, but you know.
Right. I mean, one of the things about the project that, and it's involved all sorts of experimentation and exploration over the years, is often it's been the case when we first started to engage with young people that they were kind of inside the everyday, something seemed normal to them. Something seemed really normal that to people who don't experience that from day to day is really striking, shocking, you know, and so part of our conversations within the classroom, and I think this occasion, you know, in a larger conversation, is sort of bridging that disconnect. And so I think one of the things that we've really tried to convey to the young people that we've worked with is they know things that are of critical importance for other people to know. And the question is how to bring that knowledge into a larger conversation. You're nodding. Yeah. So, I mean, that sort of, what about that for us? I mean, the condition of the sort of normalization of something that is so not normal.
Right. So I think that this is one of the real dilemmas that we're facing right now, precisely because it's so hard to engage, to have this normalization conversation, also engage with some kind of policy reform, right? First, it's hard to communicate the kind of impacts that kind of interacting with police on a daily basis has, right? It's really hard to kind of quantify this in a neat way that we can hand over to kind of policymakers, right? I know.
You may have to pull over a little bit as well.
This way? This way. Oh, now it's off.
Okay.
So as a researcher, I've been trying to kind of capture this thing, right? What it means to have interactions with officers on a daily basis. In Los Angeles, we had this great idea. We were going to give residents in a very hyper-police neighborhood voice recorders, and they were going to collect daily diaries, right? Every time they saw an officer, every time they interacted with an officer, every time they spoke about policing, right? And we thought, you know, we gave it to them in a month, we were going to come back and pick up these diaries, and we came back, and the diaries were empty, right? So there was nothing on the diaries, right? We showed up, and we were like, but you mean you didn't interact with officers at all? And they said, no, you know, nothing really big, right? Nothing really big. And so it had gotten to a point where it hadn't actually right? They were seeing officers so often that nothing had really triggered them to want to keep a diary of these police interactions. And so we pressed further and we said, but, you know, did you see any officers today? And it was, oh yeah, of course we've seen officers today. In fact, on my way over here to talk to you, there was an officer standing on the other side of the crosswalk, and I was halfway across, so I pulled out my ID, and then when I got across, I handed it to him, he checked it out, he gave it back to me, and I came back, right? So this kind of automatic response of I see an officer, I know I'm crossing the street, he's gonna wanna give me a jaywalking ticket, so I'm just gonna have my ID ready. And so I think that I think our next mission, right, isn't just to recognize that this normalization is something important to talk about, but also how we translate this into some kind of data that we can collect, and then also something that we can hand over or press upon legislators, policy leaders, right? Because I think it's a really hard kind of language to speak in at first. So I'm hoping that we can begin to do this kind of stuff here today.
I think data collection is wonderful. You know that I support that. But let me back up a little bit because I wear two hats, and I appreciate the introduction. But 4 months ago, I retired from the Denver Police Department after 25 years. And during my tenure there, when I was doing my postdoctoral work and where I met Dolores at John Jay, and I am now at John Jay, I hear a lot of conversation around policy and data, and all which are good. But when I am in this, academic world versus my policing world, I have to back up a little bit because I think that this conversation that we're having now is not only very relevant because of all the things that are happening and timely, but it also is going to mark another transition time in the way in which policing will be done. And that's critical. And I don't think that young folks pick up on those nuances, that not only is their voice important, but this is going to mark a time where policing is going to look extremely different. And as I go back in my career and I think, well, community policing was supposed to be that marker, right? This was it. This was the thing that was going to help bridge what we're talking about now, have communities move forward in partnership with police. Young folks are going to be, instead of giving IDs, high-fiving and going on their way, which has not worked out that way. But what people, I think, fail to understand from a policing perspective is that there's more going on inside that organization other than what's being felt on the street, I think is the best way that I always explain it. And there's been tons of research about officers' attitudes, behaviors, what impacts that, discretionary behavior, why do they contact some folks and they don't contact others. But if we don't go back and try to bring multiple conversations along together, we're going to be missing some things. The police organization itself has a tremendous impact on the individual. The leadership of that organization has a tremendous impact on the individual. And we've been hearing it from communities as we go through city by city, how officers are recruited, who you recruit, how you train them. All of those things are part of this larger conversation. And what I fear sometimes, and when I have these conversations with community, there's this lack of what we call police literacy. Mm-hmm. There is a want to change policy and data collect, which I can appreciate on the researcher side because it will tell you some things. But without understanding the culture of policing, are we yet then setting ourselves up for saying, well, just change your policy and that's going to take care of all those things you need to do. Data collect and these will help you make decisions on what you need to do. It's a little bit deeper than that.
Well, what about if we sort of flip the script a little bit and go back to the young people's experience? Mm-hmm. So, having broken through the veil of normalization or whatever the term
Absolutely.
would be, and engaged with kids who really are, of necessity, very close observers of the police.
Absolutely.
Right? So once there's a conversational space in which to bring that forth, they have a lot of really useful, interesting, acute things to say, as Chaselyn said. How does that knowledge connect with changes in police practice?
That knowledge is going to be very powerful.
Yeah.
But there's also something that has to happen on the police side. So as young folks are breaking through the normalization that we're being helping them usher themselves through, the same thing has to happen on the law enforcement side. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with patrol officers who still don't understand what is going on. What is this about?
So can you evoke for us a little bit what this is like from police perspective on the beat. I mean, you know, we're talking about, Forrest was describing, Titania could as easily have described the same thing, almost a ritualized pattern of, you know, regular stops, interventions that are so much part of the rhythm of the day that people don't even register them as happening. Is there some parallel or comparable thing that happens with the police?
Well, of course. I mean, so there is a normalization that goes through most law enforcement who first, you know, go through the academy, and you get into some routine, I would say. One of the things, though, that I think that we have to be careful of is that one, and I think we know this, not all officers operate in that same way. You have some that historically, even, you know, in my experience, who would go out and have some negative interaction, and when you hear that name, you know exactly who they're talking about. Right. So the question then goes back to one of supervision and accountability, right? So if we know that you hear the kids keep saying this one officer's name, you're hoping that someone is doing something about that on the inside. Right. But then there's this piece of the routineness of it, or the normalization of it. And I think a lot of folks get their perspective of what happens in law enforcement from television. That, you know, we do these, you know, drive very fast, and we have these very intense, you know, sort of interactions. But most of the day-to-day are day-to-day sort of contact routines. But a lot of how you interact with folks, one, is going to be based on your experiences historically, or how you've done things. And we hope that folks do those things in a professional way. But a lot of things that are going to also shape how officers begin to engage with folks are the calls for service that they get. And what's the information and the context of that call that you're walking into. So you're doing these multiple things, right? So you're hearing a call, a person with a gun. So you're formulating how you're going to do all of these approaches and how are you going to contact someone. And it does send you on this path. But I think what we're talking about here are officers' ability to be able to go back, and so not to go down that road and stay down that road, but say, this might not be what it originally intended to be, as opposed to taking those outcomes all the way down the road. Yeah. So, you know, I think that those ritual things happen in law enforcement as well, because the organization itself is very powerful. I had a chief tell me that we want folks to have diversity coming in, we want them to have individual personalities, we want them to be engaging, but there's something about the organization that grinds it out of them. What is it that grinds it out of them?
So, Forrest, you've done interviews with police officers in your Los Angeles context.
Right. And hanging out with a lot of officers. I actually, Tracy and I, last week we spoke a lot about this. And I think that there have been fundamentally two different parties that have been surprisingly absent from this kind of national conversation that we've been having. I think we're getting better on the side of let's actually talk to people who are policed. Right? Let's talk to young people, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think finally the people on the other side of the badge, their voices are being heard. But there's like this surprising absence of actually talking to patrol officers. Yeah. Right? Like we know absolutely nothing practically about what patrol officers are thinking as they're rolling up to interact with kids. I mean, I think it's really easy. The first thing we do is say, hey, rogue, bad apple, racist officer, right? And so. Right. But as we go out on patrols, what we find is that, yes, there are some rogue, bad apple, racist officers, but there are also some incredibly compassionate officers who, through this kind of a mass adoption of the stop and frisk technique, their behaviors almost look identical from a casual observer. But, right, they may be stopping you, and their justification might be, I want to send you away from this neighborhood, right, because I know that something's cracking off in this neighborhood. And so, you know, get moving down the street, or they're checking in on you. And I think that, and as I'm sure young people can attest, what happens is that these interactions end very differently. But I think this is the diversity and the heterogeneity actually becomes a problem for young people encountering it, right? Because one day, you've got an officer who ends a stop and frisk offering to be your mentor, right? And wanting to get you enrolled in programs, and right, it ends with this kind of fatherly tone. And then you have another officer who takes your money, right? And you can go down to the station and pick it up. So young people don't know which officer they're contacting.
Well, and I think that goes back to something Tracy alluded to, which has been very central to our work, which is just if there's a lack of accountability, then the officer who hassles you, takes your money, you know, whatever, in some ways really becomes the face of the department.
Absolutely.
And undercuts the effectiveness of the conscientious officer, the officer who wants to build a relationship. I'd like to come back to Chaselyn and Tatiana and anybody else who wants to jump in from among the young people here. You know, Forrest just said something that I think is really important, and it has been apparent in a lot of our conversations. Remember, we speculate about the police. We role play what would be in that police officer's mind coming into this situation, but in truth, we don't know. You know, so it's kind of fascinating to think that in this big national conversation, you know, as Forrest said, youth are more represented now, although just beginning to be. And I think, you know, there's certain things that, you know, still have to be fully voiced, documented, elaborated. But that the police who are so central to this conversation are curiously muted in it. And you know, so the one question, and certainly a question for our project, is whether there are ways in which it might be possible to build as patient, exploratory a conversation as we've built with young people, with police officers, and whether that kind of space could exist. I think if it did, it would be revelatory for a lot of us.
Right.
But let's come back to what we don't know about the police, to the sense, you know, Chaselyn, we've done all sorts of different conversations and exercises trying to elicit from young people what they think is going on with the police. Can you report on some of that?
Yeah, the kids are incredibly generous in their attitudes towards police officers. They often attribute an officer treating them disrespectfully to, like, maybe he had a bad day. It's like every week they encounter an officer who just had a bad day. And sometimes I think that's because of them just being who they are and living in the world and attempting to reconcile what's happening to them with something that makes sense. That doesn't mean that they're a suspect or they're a criminal or they're doing something to deserve this behavior, but rather they're sort of like encountering just a random bad officer on a bad day. The other thing that kids consistently do when they imagine what police are dealing with is they think about the crime and the danger that they face in their own lives. So I think often they talk about navigating their neighborhoods, and they don't just navigate the dangerous people on their block, they navigate through the police in the same way. You heard a little bit of that in the films. The kids are avoiding police officers because the police are a similar threat to them. Right? Let's see.
And can you describe, you came up with a wonderful list once of things that we had culled from conversations with kids about their avoidance strategies. And this is, you know, we talk about this a lot, is how do you stay safe? And for the kids, that's partly navigating gang terrain, but it's also avoiding encounters with the police, avoiding adverse encounters.
I'm gonna let Tatiana read it. It's in the paper, but these are just.
Let Tatiana.
I wouldn't even. They're direct quotes from kids when we collect. Like, what do you do to avoid the police?
Don't walk alone. Don't walk in groups. Don't make eye contact. Don't look away too quickly. Don't move too fast. Don't linger. Don't do anything. Don't do nothing.
I mean, that really came out of our conversations, sort of distilled. So it's like trying to decode something, trying to come up with some, you know, secret game plan for moving around your neighborhood.
And I think that they're navigating the same world that the police officers are.
Yeah.
Right? Like on your streets, everyone has to keep their head up, pay attention, take care of that.
Be cautious. All of that.
I mean, the other thing I would add to that is, and some of the people in the room have told us this, that the often, particularly among the boys, they will say, well, I've figured out how to not have encounters with the police. I just never leave home. I only go out under darkness, in a car. Sort of imagine that. So there's a kind of self-policing dynamic, which is a real loss of freedom. At a time when teenagers should be out in the world, sort of exploring. Are there any beat officers in the room? Anybody who are kind of on the ground as officers? Maybe we can return to that question. But I'd be, again, the police perspective on something that we have a lot of narrative and observation from the kids about, what these encounters feel like.
The kids know their neighborhoods so well. They repeatedly tell stories of, they can tell in just a second, like right when they get off the bus, they can tell if something's happening. They can tell if someone's missing from where they're supposed to be. And that knowledge is incredibly valuable knowledge for navigating through those dangers. And I think sometimes the kids express, if only the police officers knew what we know, right? If police knew who was dangerous, if police had the knowledge that we had, they wouldn't bother us so much. It's kind of like I don't know.
Which is interesting, because what you hear the police say, you hear them voice their frustration about why folks won't talk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is that exact same thing. So young folks are saying, we just had a different type of relationship. Can you imagine the types of things that I could share with you?
Right.
And then the law enforcement, on the other hand, telling you that, well, we don't get why they don't talk. And so a little bit when you mentioned, are there any patrol officers in the room? I mean, to me, that kind of speaks to that, right? So one of the things that all of us, I believe, agree that the leadership in law enforcement is taking hold of this, and they understand the importance of it. Mm-hmm. But, with the exception of smaller law enforcement agencies, very rarely does a chief ride in a patrol car, answer calls, and go door to door. All of that's done on the ground level. Mm-hmm. And without that ground level officer reflection and hearing these stories and understanding how they impact certain communities, we're going to have a lot more work to do.
Tatiana, tell us a little more about that impact in terms of, would you call the police? If you felt threatened, if you witnessed a crime? That's a long pause.
Mm-hmm. Says a lot.
I don't, I've been through some things, I needed to call the police. But, when I did call the police, it's not, they always ask questions like, well, what's happening? Did you try this? Did you do this? Well, or, they just don't come. And, other times it's just.
So part of the frustration is they're unresponsive.
Trying to get them,
when you call.
Yeah.
What about your classmates and friends? I mean, would people, Tracy was just talking about the information that could be shared that would make such a difference. If the police were engaged in an investigation and came around looking for information.
I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't.
Yeah. What about the rest of you?
Would you?
Wait, what was the question?
The question was, if the police were in your neighborhood doing an investigation, what happens in such and such a situation, would you cooperate with them?
No. Yeah, no, I won't.
Cooperate would mean, engage with them, answer questions they might have.
Would you talk to the police if the police came, or if you made a call?
It depends on what type of questions they ask me. If they want me to be involved in something.
Can you hold it up a little more? Yeah.
If they ask me questions that would involve me to be in the witness protection, no, I won't answer those type of questions. But if it's small questions that would probably help them along, with their job as far as helping us, really, if they really want to help us, I would answer the question. Yeah.
So what if you had information that would maybe help the police? You heard that something's brewing, something might go down, and you had some information. Would you reach out to the police to share that?
No.
No. What about others?
No, I will not tell any information because I know my side of town and they found out everything, you know? So if they found out I was telling anything, that might be my life. I love my life.
Okay. So you're not
So
going
can
to be a tattletale.
No.
Can I interrupt?
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
What if you?
Yeah.
Please.
You clearly don't.
But no, I wouldn't answer any question because when talking to the police, everything you said is being used against. Thank you. But everything you said is being used against you. So by giving them the information, the question may become, well, how do you know this information? And we know Chicago is a false confession capital, so we just always remain silent. We work with police and allow them to do their job and investigate and find out if something's going on in your neighborhood.
So how would you respond to those concerns?
I mean, it's a valid concern. I mean, you hear them all the time. I mean, law enforcement hears this all the time. My question, so I'd add to that question, if you had a relationship with a police officer, would you answer questions? If you knew them? Would it raise the stakes a little bit and say, yeah, I might tell you half a story, I don't know, I might tell you nothing?
I mean, I know officers, I'm in the kids in caps, and if they come out asking questions, I'm not gonna tell them, I'm gonna go to the guy I know. So
You go to one, if you knew someone that you felt comfortable with.
If I feel comfortable, I would probably, maybe, but depending on who it is and if I feel like it, yeah, it's most likely a maybe. I don't really know.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
We've had hundreds of conversations with the kids now about not just would you call the police, but we like level it out. Like, would you call if you saw a break-in? Would you call if you saw an attack? Would you call if you saw a murder? Would you, like every level. And the kids are just generally distrustful. But I think often when we talk about people who don't call the police, we talk about like snitches get stitches or something. And it's such a flat view of the kids to say like, oh, they're not helpful or cooperating. No, they know the resources in their community that are going to be more effective as alternatives to the police department, because they don't say they're not going to call anyone. They just say they're not going to call the police, like they might call an uncle or a cousin or a neighbor. And I think part of the difficulty is that police often aren't part of that network.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to tap into that if you don't know your community.
So I think that is an important point that has come up repeatedly, is that there are sort of alternative strategies. There are alternative strategies. Some of those are fairly problematic. Street gangs can be seen as a form of public safety, in terms of you mess with me, my people are going to mess with you. But there are lots of other informal things we've had described, as Chaselin said. An uncle who is a kind of mediator who will manage a situation that you feel outmatched by. But it's a kind of fascinating idea that those informal systems of public safety might connect with rather than be wholly separate from law enforcement.
Right, the relationship has placed this sort of informal 911 system in the community versus calling the police.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things, not now, but I would say just very prevalent, is that you have these aha moments with law enforcement, just now getting to this piece of saying, we understand folks won't call the police, we understand that it's a trust issue if they don't call the police. The question is, and the calls and requests for help, is how do we repair this? What do we do?
And I think there's also a circularity to it. We've had, among the scenarios Chaselin was mentioning, we've said, well, imagine that your brother, a friend, is shot and you know who did it. Would you call the police with that information? And often they will say, no, I wouldn't call the police because they wouldn't be able to close the case because nobody would cooperate with them. So, you have this thing that just keeps feeding on itself. Yeah.
Well, don't you know how like people look up to celebrities and like they inspirational and stuff to people?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
How like people look up to celebrities and they inspire them and motivate them? Certain celebrities.
Did you hear?
Mostly it's the young people. Y'all hear me? Oh.
Yeah, there, I think it's up to your close.
Like the police have a big authority over us, so like we looking at them based off. First of all, the media is like messing us all up. Social media had everybody grouping and ungrouping and had gangs. It's like it'll lead to one big event and it'll lead to a small event, and like they'll say like the cops is ops. They are right on all on the police cars, mess up their cars. So I know the police, I know they feeling some type of way about, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. And I know we feeling some type of way about a whole bunch of stuff, which is why I had to keep on going back and forth like a gang versus a gang. Yeah.
I got part of it.
Taishika. Okay.
Yeah.
Both have kind of animosity towards one another. They don't trust each other, and that the media and the social media contribute to that.
Feed that.
There's the feeding it.
Since they both don't trust one another, that feeds into each other's distrust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't trust you, that makes you not trust police and vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful.
Can I
Oh, just go ahead first.
And what else I feel like she was trying to say was like, it kind of feels like us against them in a way.
Right.
And it's a lot of intimidation when we do go to the police and, you know, just trying to, like you said, like we police ourselves, is just trying to keep as much of that away, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, with, like she said, with the CPDK and all of that, it's like, and I think it's also like, I don't think police are involved in the communities like they should be.
So there's an interesting thread here, and it's something that you and I talked about once, Forrest, that sort of stuck with me, which is, you know, in sort of some of the classic sort of sociological literature, particularly coming out of the University of Chicago, it might be characterized as really neighborhood ineffectiveness, being, you know, the sort of community is not effective. There's a whole discourse about community efficacy. So not to engage with a public an institution like the police. But what we're often hearing described are forms of community efficacy that are kind of outside the law,
Right.
but are efforts to compensate for what people experience as abandonment and harassment. Is there something more to say about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can't stress and we can't underestimate just how important this lack of legitimacy is, right? The fact that young people and folks in certain communities absolutely will not call the police, I think not only needs to alarm us, but perhaps we can use this as a measure for actually asking, are the police doing a good job? Right now we use a measure of have they reduced crime, but what if we use as a measure, are people in this neighborhood actually willing to call the police, right? I think this is not just a matter of solving crimes, it's also a matter of, oftentimes, this is the only interaction that young people have with the state, right? And they're encountering a state that they fundamentally don't trust. What kind of citizens can we expect them to grow into if they begin their lives fundamentally mistrusting the state, right? And then finally, the research shows that the level of legitimacy that people feel towards the police, towards their government, has a direct correlation with whether they commit crime, whether they vote, how well they do in civil society, even like how well they do in school. So I mean, I think I don't think that we can overstress, I guess, the fact that right young people are not willing to call the police. I think it's an issue that expands far beyond, hey, solve the crime that just happened down the street. Like this is a fundamental issue in our democracy, really, if we think about it.
And it's interesting that you put it in terms of citizenship.
Absolutely.
So it
we're teaching them how to interact with the state, right?
Yeah.
We're teaching them these lessons that they're going to be carrying forward as adults. This is training. This is training for being American citizens.
Yeah. And what a number of young people have said to us in trying to characterize this is a paraphrase, but have said in effect, characterize the impact of being regularly stopped. And you know, the stops don't have to be harsh or abusive to leave a residue, as you well know. Young people will say, you know, often in other words, that they were treated immediately like suspects rather than citizens. You know, the presumption of being suspect and not having standing as citizens. A citizen calls the police and the expectation that they intervene and protect them.
Right. We have a few questions.
Yeah.
What's that?
There's a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Barbara Keys, and I'm a long ways from being a teenager, but I can tell you this, it's a real conundrum where the police are concerned. In raising 4 children of my own, 2 boys and 2 girls, I was just as much afraid of the police as I was the gang. And there is no way I would let a police officer come and interrogate my child without me being there, probably with a lawyer. It just does not make any sense at all. And these young people who have cooperated with you here at the University of Chicago, I hope that you have prepared a way that maybe one day they can be students here at the law school of the University of Chicago. There is no reason why you should take their valuable resources and data and use them as guinea pigs and they not have any options to attend here. Okay? The other thing I want to say as a parent, and that's what I consider myself as a professional parent at this point, is that with these police encounters, on whose behalf are the police acting? When they all get together and have the same script, have the same talking points, they all know how to jump out of the car and put our children up against the wall, and the script is repeated. Who is orchestrating this? Who is benefiting by a whole segment of our society feeling like they've got to lower their eyes and get off the sidewalk and not be men? And not, where is this coming? What are they teaching police in the academy that tell them that they have to police our neighborhood and protect other people's neighborhood? Where does racism come in? That has got to be a part of what you're saying. I live in the 5th District. I live down there where John Burge was. And the police department has yet to apologize to my community for the way that they acted. But, I mean, this is a broad subject, and I don't want to keep you from focusing on what you're trying to focus. But I don't know about you using our children in this way without having a whole lot of parents involved in it.
JT? Yeah. Also, I should say there are microphones in the back if anybody wants to speak from the back.
There's a gentleman back there, and
Sorry.
About can the kids come here?
Yeah, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right.
So
I think, if I can, one thing you touched on was a script, a ritual. And something we ask the kids to do a lot is to role play the encounters with the police, because they have such specific knowledge about the way police officers move their bodies, about where they keep their hands on their guns and their vests, about the type of language that police officers come at them with all the time. And it does feel like a script. It feels like the police are playing a very specific role, and that role is for the major benefit of richer, whiter, northern in Chicago neighborhoods. And the kids are feeling the brunt of it. I don't know if you
Can I
want to
add
talk
to this,
to
Jason?
it.
That I think that,
Yeah.
right, so I think that we have, what you identify is an inequality or racism that is feeding police policies, but I think that there's also a way to think about that ritual as a form of inequality in a different way, which is, I mean, the stories that we hear about the savvy and resilience of learning an officer's small movement tics and where I need to look and how I need to wear my hair and the fact I need to throw my arms around a young woman to make it look as though I'm not a potential gang member and I need to walk down the street, not that street. I mean, there's a way, this is a problem of excess, right? This is so much stuff that young people have to carry around their heads, in particular neighborhoods, just to get down the street without a stop and frisk, right? That we can think about that being a form of inequality as well, right? That to have to carry around this kind of cognitive load, right? That isn't carried around by folks getting off the bus in other neighborhoods, right? You can kind of put your head in the clouds and, daydream. But getting off the bus, I think for a lot of the young people involved in this project is a kind of strategic thought process.
But
to
there's a
ensure
larger
safety.
question. I agree with you. But there was a larger question that was asked though, on whose behalf are policing certain communities versus others? And to me, that's the question that's back on the table, and where you hear the raising of the voices. On whose behalf are you doing this? Who said this was the way to go, and to reach what outcomes? And that is the largest question to me that has to be answered. And that was, in the guise of community policing. That was the other piece that was on the table, right? So we were doing this to bring community together. Here we are 25 years later, and the outcomes are still the same. And so as you look at larger, legislative policy, even on the local level, and it's a really fundamental question, who said this was the way to do this? And that is a question that now lies back at the feet of not just law enforcement, but the justice system as a whole to answer that question.
But speaking,
So I do want to say that within this framework of community policing, if you go to the community policing meetings in Woodlawn, if you go to the community policing meetings in Englewood, what you'll hear is a cry out for more police. Right, so there's a way in which
with a few dissenters,
residents are responding to precarious conditions. So this is the dilemma, right? That it's an over-policed, under-protected dilemma, right? That when police aren't responding in particular ways, residents have few other options to call on. And there are a whole group of residents, and I think rightly so, who are demanding that the police step up and deliver more officers into neighborhoods. So I mean, I just want to complicate, right, what I think is a overly simplistic way of thinking about who is telling the police to come in and charge into the neighborhood. I think, yes, there is a kind of north side, south side divide. I mean, I do think there are racial elements, but I think once we're on the ground, we see a more complex dynamic. And so I just don't want to let the conversation slip into a kind of oversimplified way of thinking about who's calling for more policing, because there are many people in very over-policed communities still calling for more police because they want to be protected.
JT, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Okay, so,
I'm sorry?
so we have one student
One
up
here,
that wants
and
to
then we'll come
directly
back.
respond, and then
I wanted to kind of backtrack the conversation back to what Jamie was describing earlier about what is a way that we can actually combat this problem. And what I've seen as a youth mentor, I'm 5 years out of my teenage years, but as a youth mentor, I mentor kids, and I see police officers come into my program as of UCPD, CPD, and come in and get their bikes fixed and interact with our kids because we have those contracts. Our kids are the ones that work on those bicycles and interact with those police officers. And what I've seen over the years and over the summertime extraordinarily is when those police officers come in with their badge on and their uniform and they're talking to our kids like they're like humans, then that relationship builds. And we do have a relationship with the police departments throughout our communities and neighborhoods. It's just that the disconnect happens between that and then the other part of the community. There's a bunch of different parts of the community. You have a good part and you have a bad part. A lot of people don't see those, but there is a line there. You have kids that want to do right, then you have kids that fall into the environment and that don't do right just because of the way society directs them that they are criminals. If the police come in and evidently show that they're not looking at kids as criminals, that changes the whole dynamics of how the kids look at them. I have little girls at my shop that that has interacted with police officers in a negative way before they got the positive way, then after interacting with that police officer in a positive way, the whole light of the way they see police officers has changed. And it has changed for me too. As an adult and going through that as a kid, and then coming up and actually conversating with a police officer to see where they were coming from and how they feel about the whole situation, things change. The whole dynamic changed. It's not a me against them, it's actually good against bad, because there are bad people in this world, and there are good people. There are hundreds of billions of, not billions, but millions of police officers that do good things, but there are some that don't do good things. There are some that do discriminate. There are some that break the laws that they enforce the most. And the thing is, you have to connect with the community, because if you don't, nothing's going to get solved, and we're just going to have these conversations for hundreds of thousands of years.
So just one comment on that I think we've seen multiple times in our conversations at Hyde Park Academy is, we've heard, I think Jason talked before about the generosity of the young people we've been talking to. They would like to be able to trust the police. They would like to, I don't want to overgeneralize, but that's a very strong undercurrent of regret that this is the situation, regret that this is how they feel. And so I think there's grounds for optimism in the idea that some of the really negative attitudes, those long pauses about would you call the police, might be quite shallowly rooted, but we won't know until there's counter evidence. Right. They won't know, we won't know until there are things like JT described of relationships that are outside the law enforcement relationship.
I think that relationship works because the kids are experts on the bites. They're professionals, right? Like the police are coming for a service and the kids tell them like, you really ride your brakes too hard. It's like a totally different script from the police being the experts in that situation.
Because you don't get that reaction to this guy's coming to me like I'm a criminal. You get that reaction, this guy's coming to me because he knows that I know how to work in this fight. He needs me to fix his fight because he can't ride with police. So I think our kids get that concept. And when you get that concept, and that concept is just bigger than just a bicycle, then a relationship grows. Without that relationship, the issue is persistent.
What I'm going to say is going to be directed.
You want to get a mic? Yeah.
Okay. What I'm going to say is going to be directed at police officers. Okay.
All right.
What I'm going to say is going to be directed at police officers because I worked as a police officer. I worked as an academic. Tell Dr. John Klinger I said hello at John Jay College. Okay. I'll try to speak low. And also, as a gang member, so I have run the gamut in terms of young people being a gang member, going to school, getting a PhD, being a police officer. So what I want to say is this. Both the police and young people have a fear of establishing positive relationships. We have to change the culture in law enforcement, and we start changing that culture by changing the theoretical framework that we currently use. As police officers, we use a deterrent framework, which is based on what? It's based on fear. So fear is the element that keeps relationships from coming together where people can hold candid discussions about how they actually feel in the assumptions that they hold. And until we're able to have those type of dialogues, we won't get a truthful dialogue where we can start, instead of addressing symptoms, addressing real problems, okay? And so the model that police use as part of the deterrent model is what we call in business as the zero-sum game. The zero-sum game came from part of the military. It means that I win, you lose. So this is where the philosophy of we versus them came from. Now, the we versus them philosophy initially originated within the police department and spilled out into the community. And the reason it originated within the police department was that the police department, even though it is supposed to deal with impartiality, they had issues with affirmative action, they had issues with female recruits, they had issues with promotions, and so this we versus them mentality originated within the police department. It has never been addressed, and so when you have a problem, and you plug in something like a body cam, we need body cam, but body cams does not address the assumptions that created the problem.
Right.
Okay? And
Great.
I'm sorry.
Can I had a question for Dr. Kesey. So many kids here have reported to us, and just their reality of they think that when police look at them, police look at the black kids like with suspicion of being a criminal. How do you think police look at our kids?
I think that is how not all.
Yeah, how do you see our kids?
Well, you know, I see our kids. I grew up in that neighborhood, so I know how I see our kids. I see our kids as kids. But one of the things that the gentleman in the back was referring to is this issue of, you know, you can call it unconscious bias, you can call it implicit bias, but it is that salient connection of blackface and criminality. And so to say that does not exist among policing would be incorrect. It does. The question then becomes, what can you do? And how do you begin to train that or screen for that? And so police view juveniles and young people and teenagers and adults and older people in various different ways. And the way I tie it back is what happens with those outcomes, right? So if I automatically go to the high school and there's police officers in the high school, and we don't question why there are police officers in the high school. You know? Yes, Mom, you do. I know you do. But and so what's their purpose, right? So then for me, I think that when we have these conversations on a larger issue about how do you see youth, it really comes down to not just the individual officer, but how the organization itself creates that atmosphere, as was said around those things. And it goes back to fundamental pieces like hotspot policing, about being overly policed in one community and not in another community. It goes back to, again, as the gentleman said in the back, procedural justice happening within organizations. If you don't think that organizations are having problems that reflect those of the community, and then you're asking officers to go out into patrol with the same baggage on their shoulders that are happening outside, what does that dynamic look like? You know, so if you are having problems recruiting men of color because they're all in prison, then how do you then explain as a chief that, well, you know, the community is asking you to have your organization reflect that of the community? Well, since they've all been shot through the pipeline and you can't pass a background, what does that say? So those realizations are starting to come back.
So can I ask, we're going to have to wrap fairly soon, maybe one more question, but I wanted to ask, in light of a number of things that have been said, did you say professional parent or full-time parent? How did you describe yourself?
I am a professional parent.
Professional parent.
All
And
of my
the
academic
gentleman in back.
knowledge and everything, all of my acumen in the various fields that I've been in, I have funneled into being a parent. And so I am a professional parent.
I get it. But her question that Forrest then elaborated on in interesting ways about what is it, why, what's going on when some communities are protected and some are policed.
Can I ask?
Next week you're reappointed in Denver. You're superintendent in Denver. In light of these concerns raised in this room, what are the first things you do with that leadership role? You yourself have said how important leadership is in this.
Well, the first thing that you do is that you're not in the community in times of crisis. that is an ongoing, continuing relationship that you have with, and I usually don't define community because community is different depending on where you are and how the community defines itself. But often what you find happening is that with policing, we have a tendency to go along traditional threads, right? So, and I'll just briefly talk about a community advisory board. And I was at a community advisory board in California just the day before yesterday. And I looked at the community advisory board, and then I'm listening to the conversations, and I'm hearing what's being said, and there's very clear absent voices from that. But there's a tendency to go towards those people that are supportive of what you do versus those who can push back and hold you accountable to what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, not only do you have to then go in and engage and become a part of community and to speak with community, but that is something the officers also have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just you in times of crisis, the command staff going out and saying, you know, we're very sorry for all these things. If it's not reflected from the bottom up, regardless of what I do at the top, it's not really going to matter. It'll matter to the politicians. It'll matter for those who vote. It'll matter for the manager or the city attorney or city mayor that appointed me. But when you're talking about affecting change on the lowest level, that chief has to be at that lowest level as much as they possibly can to have the conversations, which some are having and some are not, about why are we in the state that we are in today. And a lot of officers don't understand the historical context of policing and how we came to be today. They certainly do not get the young folks, and social media aside, you know, you don't take a class in adolescent development or whatever. So there is a lot of things that I would say that they're not in the book, but on a human relation sort of level that should be, as Mom said, taught to you anyway.
Right.
You know, you speak to people when spoken to, you get out of your car, they get the fear factor, they understand that your safety is at risk. But most of my work in the community as a law enforcement was because the folks in the community knew me. And they knew if something was wrong. They might not tell me everything, but they would find a way to get something to me. And so I think that a lot of what you'll see over the next, hopefully 5 to 10 years, there is a new generation of law enforcement leadership that is coming. It looks a lot different than when I was on 25 years ago. Some get it, some don't. But that's a part of learning, and it's also a part of how do you restructure that organization so it doesn't create what we're doing here today, trying to find bridges back to one another.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult. There's multiple levels in which these things have to be done. But is it insurmountable? No, but you have to address what's happening.
But so if just to reinterpret what you said in light of the themes of the conference, if you were in that leadership position, it sounds like a great priority would be to bring together these kind of spheres or bubbles that aren't really connecting of people in terms of their experience, in terms of who they're talking to, and who they're listening to. So really, again, you know, what we're trying to do with this conference and with the ongoing work is to create those points of intersection and extend the conversation. I think we'll take one more question.
Can we get Tatiana first?
Pardon
Sorry,
me?
Jamie, up here. Can we get Tatiana first?
What I wanted to say was like, can you hear me? Like, what I wanted to say was, like overall, like, I was asked a question, no, we were asking questions the other day, like, what would a police officer do if they seen a group of black males versus a group of white males? And, you know, like, what would you do? And we even, like, answered the questions for ourselves. And, you know, when we get stopped, the occasional stop, it's just so that they could, you know, properly, you know, establish that they have power and to make sure that they scare us. But I just feel like sometimes we are just being black at the wrong time. Like, when we just, I don't know, like, it's just, you really have to, like, really act a certain way. And I just had a brain freeze.
That's okay. We put you through a lot. It's been a long panel. One last question promised, and then we'll close, take a break, and reconvene. Did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, University of Chicago, for having a wonderful engagement with youth and our police. Thank you to our young people in particular for bringing voice to your concerns and sharing that with the community. I think that's a very important aspect to what it is that may, in fact, bring about to change. The young lady, thank you so much for being a part of the panel. To our scholars, in relation to what we see as a systemic issue or concern nationwide, just not here in the city of Chicago, I'd like to bring the historical aspect into what it is that we see today as a concern. If we were in the year 1776, if we were in 1865, if we were in 1964, would this conversation be any different than it is today? And if in fact that is the case, what are we looking at as a law school, a prominent one in the world, if not just here in the city of Chicago? I think we got a president that came from this place. I could be wrong. But how would we address the judicial system where we know that federal funding actually goes to incarceration? We know that now we have companies that are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange that actually build private prisons. We know that there's an economy base, that economic base that actually ensures that, hey, if we don't fill up these slots in these prisons, we don't get our economic return. Our investment is therefore lost. If we're not looking at this as an economic and not just a social aspect of our community, then we won't realize why there's a 60-40 dynamic of prisoners that are men and women of color related to other communities, when we know that the statistics say, if I'm wrong, please correct me, that the crime rates in all those communities are just about the same. How do we address that? And I'd like all three scholars to please respond.
So if we want to take a swing briefly
Sure,
at that, because it's a big question.
I mean, I will say, you bring up a fantastic point. I think that you precisely highlight the fact that we are not encountering a reality that is new, right? I mean, we can talk about the economic history, we can talk about convict leasing. I mean, we're encountering, right, a kind of systematic incarceration and policing of communities of color that this country is founded upon, right? But I think that this conversation is actually different now, precisely because we are now living in a place that is declared post-racial, right? No, but this matters, right? The context within which we are trying to challenge these kinds of patterns of incarceration, I do think is different. I'm not saying we're living in a post-racial. I see the look on your face. Do you think? No. I'm saying it's especially difficult precisely because there is a myth of a post-racial America, right? That there is a drive to not acknowledge the fact that we see incredible disparities.
And not to be rude or intrusive, but the paradigm is that the economic issue that invented the United States of America is still the economic issue that drives the prison industrial complex.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Ergo, we have issues that have relations that don't deal necessarily with the police against the community. The police are the community. That's a myth. That's a psychological game that is being played. These people want to go home and be safe, just like the people who live in the communities want to go home and be safe. One, people are charged with, a certain responsibility to ensure safety in the community. The other one is saying, we just want to be safe. But when they take off that uniform, they put that gun up, they actually live in those communities. So to actually create an imaginary divide makes no sense. That is not realistic, at least from my approach. Now, that perspective might be written differently somewhere in some laws. But the reality is the economic base that is generated from the prison industrial complex. And now we have people who work for prison outfits that make furniture, do customer service call. I call the University of Chicago. I may be talking to a receptionist in a prisonal institution that is actually saving money, right? Now this young man can't find a job, so he builds a bike, and who knows how long that'll last, because I'm a computer programmer. And I can program a computer to build that bike break, and he's saying, well, now what do I do? Do I grab a gun, or do I go back to school? There's no funding for school. So the reality is the economic base is more so the issue than it is policing or our youth, because this has been a situation since 1600s, transatlantic. So how do we address that concern in a reasonable, rational way?
I hate to do this at such an interesting point in the conversation. We're out of time for this panel. I assure you we will return to those questions in the course of the conference, and I appreciate the clarity with which you raised them. So let's take a break. A 10-minute break, and we're back.